Our text for today does talk about Jesus water skiing without skis and without a boat. We read from John's Gospel, chapter 6, verses 1 through 21. After this, Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias. A large crowd kept following him because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. Now the Passover, the festival of the Jews, was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And he said this to test Philip, for he himself knew what he was going to do. Philip answered Jesus, 6 months' wages would not buy enough bread for each of them to get even a little. One of the disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to Jesus, "There's a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish, but what are they among so many people?" Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed the loaves to those who were seated, to also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when the crowd was satisfied, Jesus told his disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." And so they gathered up the fragments, and from them, left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw this sign that Jesus had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who is come into the world." And Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king. He withdrew again to the mountain by himself. And when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, started across the sea to Capernaum, and it was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. When the disciples had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat. They were terrified. But Jesus said to them, "I am. Do not be afraid." Then the disciples wanted to take Jesus into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. We are in the middle of hurricane season here in Central Florida, aren't we? This is something that we might hardly even have noticed yet this year because it's been such a season of little activity, and we should be glad for that. We do not need a repeat of the 2004 or the 2005 seasons. Hurricane Charlie was the largest storm that went through in 2004, followed, if you recall, in quick succession by Frances and Ivan and Jean. That 2004 storm season was the record storm season until the very next year, which is the year that they ran out of names for storms, and that was the year also that Katrina devastated New Orleans. Now here, as Central Floridians, we were a little bit surprised, if you remember, about the fact that Hurricane Charlie came through. We weren't supposed to be hit at all by that hurricane, let alone hit with such force. The Ruta family, we were entertaining dinner guests that evening, didn't bother to cancel, and so our dinner guests quickly became slumber party guests when trees fell on this side of the house and that side of the house and blocked all of the exits to our neighborhood. Mr. Ruta was heard to comment as the winds subsided, when the eye of the storm passed directly over us, "Well, I guess we were in the path of the storm." Mrs. Ruta, who comes from the West Coast and can handle earthquakes and volcanic eruptions and a tsunami in a pinch, told Mr. Ruta, "This one's on you. You were born in Florida, you're in charge of hurricanes." We are always in the middle of what we might call the human storm season. The hurricane season, as you know, goes from June to November. Human storm season begins the day we're born and it ends the day that we die. The years in which there is little storm activity in our lives is certainly the years that we are grateful for. As Christians, we are continually surprised by the fact that we are hit by storms of life. We think about those storms, we give them names like hurricane divorce or hurricane cancer or maybe tropical storm unemployment for a while, and we think that's not supposed to have hit us, and certainly not without such force. We have been influenced in our religious culture for so long by false theologies that tell us that being saved is the same thing as being safe. If you read magazines like Christianity Today, you'll often see articles written by people who say, "Well, I didn't think that that would happen to me. I didn't think that I would have adultery in my life. I didn't think my kids would end up in jail." Why? Because I'm a good Christian. That's the surprise that they write about. And we have also been influenced by the peddlers of the prosperity gospel, the ones who tell us that we are to expect health and wealth. And when those things don't come, we're disappointed and disillusioned. But bad things happen to good Christians all the time, in same measure as they happen to non-Christians. We come to church on Sundays and we pretend, don't we? We pretend that everything is swell in our lives. How are you doing? I'm swell on Sundays. And the reality is that we are just as likely to have come crawling through those doors, lonely and empty and confused, suffering perhaps from some kind of physical hurt. And all of us at some point from some kind of anxiety or uncertainty about the trees that we are fearful are going to come crashing through the roofs of our lives. Our text for today describes a time when Jesus comes walking across the water to meet us where we are experiencing those fears, where we are fearful, where we are lonely, where we are empty, where we are hurting, where we are anxious and burdened. He comes not to remove the storms, but to show us the way through. Jesus is the calm and the grace and the peace in the eye of the storm. If you crawled here today, if you crawled through those doors today, battered by the storms of your lives in this broken and sinful world where we live in human storm season all the time for all of our lives, there is good news. There's good news. In Jesus Christ, there is salvation. There is a way to be taken safely through the storms. When we acknowledge our sinfulness, when we accept the gracious gift of God's forgiveness, when we put our faith in the eye of the storm, there is hope and there is healing for us. a life, an abundant life, even in our human storms, that God desires for us an eternal life in His presence forever. That's it. That's the conclusion of the sermon today. I'm giving it to you up front because our text contains not one, almost, Steve, not one, but two miracle accounts. And miracles are the kiss of death for sermons. The trouble with miracles is that they don't work for us. They don't work for us today. In fact, accounts of the miraculous actually encourage us to doubt more than they engage us in faith these days. Our post-Enlightenment minds just don't go there. We're simply not impressed by accounts of miracles. Our cultural insistence on scientific explanation for everything has all but robbed us of our capacity to wonder about the meaning that might be contained in those accounts of the miraculous. So why should we bother drilling down through the meaning of texts like we have for this morning? The text of Jesus feeding the 5,000, Jesus walking on the water. If we're just going to throw in the towel at the first mention of those barley loaves being multiplied and distributed to the crowds. Or the first time that we get into the part where Jesus is skipping across the water without sinking. Why speculate about the fact that these miracles have a certain significance, and we know that because they appear across all of the Gospels? Why explore the significance that John puts in his Gospel and what he's trying to communicate about Jesus if we're just going to nod politely or maybe even nod off because miracles are out of fashion in our lives and in our culture and in our churches these days? We could, this is one way we could approach this, we could explain the miracles away. We could do that. The miracle of feeding 5,000, one of the interpretations, there are many interpretations that we could accept and adopt for this morning, is that all of that abundance of food that is generated as the result of Jesus calling that question of where are we going to find the food is to say that young boy's willingness to give up his own lunch shamed everybody else to give up their secret stashes of lunch to share with their neighbors. But if we adopt that interpretation, what is that saying about God? What is that saying about God? Not much. Doesn't say much about God at all. That is a story, that kind of interpretation is a story of people shamed into doing something that doesn't talk at all about divine grace. It talks about human ability to solve our own problems if we just are given a reminder of how to do it. And walking on the water is even easier to deal with than that. I mean, one interpretation, one way around that account is to simply say that Jesus' nocturnal stroll is that he's walking by the water instead of on the water. The Greek word allows for both of those interpretations. But what does that say about us as believers? What does that say about us as believers if that's the way we want to go with the text? Again, not much. We're not much of believing. Jesus water skiing barefoot and without a boat is pretty incredible. It's pretty incredible. But so is a dead body come back to life. And we might be able to interpret around our text for today by saying, well, he's just kind of by the water instead of on the water. But I want to caution you to think carefully about interpreting around the resurrection. If that's the way that we want to do this. You know, the resurrection, you think of a Jenga game, you know, you've got those pieces and you get to the bottom, you start pulling out those bottom pieces. The bottom piece of the Christian Jenga game is the resurrection. You might be able to lose a piece at the top here or there on, you know, the textual interpretation, but you start pulling out that bottom piece of the Christian Jenga game, and what happens? The whole thing falls over. To be fair, belief is a little more complicated than Jenga. I believe, help my unbelief in the same breath. It's more complicated. Miracles are hard. They're hard. By definition, they are something that can't be explained. They require that we suspend our post-Enlightenment scientific minds and our postmodern pretentious interpretations of the text. And they require that we crank up our capacity to wonder. And so we read in verse 1, after this. Well, after what? So we go back to chapter 5, and what we find is Jesus concerned about the fact that the people are not believing what Moses said and wrote. They're having difficulty understanding. And so chapter 6, as John devotes himself to the writing of his gospel, is the story of Jesus reenacting Moses' signature move in the Passover. It's the signature move of Moses, the Passover. And the clue in the text is verse 4, when there's a gratuitous reference to the fact that, oh, the Passover is on us. That's the clue. So you've got the context here. This is what Jesus is doing. And as you blow through the text a little bit more quickly, and don't get bogged down in explaining the miracle or being embarrassed by the miracle, is you see that reenactment, that re-enlivening of Moses' work. And so we read here about how Moses led the people through the water. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Moses goes up mountains, Jesus goes up mountains. The people are hungry and grumbling. The people are hungry and grumbling. There is a test of the people. Jesus tests his disciples. Are you tracking, is what he says to the disciples. Are you tracking what I'm doing? Jesus says to Philip, where are we to buy bread for these people to eat? Now there's not a Publix nearby. This is not a question that requires the formation of a committee. And yet that's what the disciples do. They go into committee mode. They start talking about things that are material. They're like, well, okay, we've got enough. It's going to take this much money, and there's one boy with this many blows. They go into what we would do, into the material. Jesus is talking manna at this point. They gather, they break, they bless, they eat, and there are 12 baskets left over. The people are seeing that this is the sign that Jesus, in fact, is the prophet promised. Verse 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, they begin to get it, but they don't quite get it. They say, this is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world, except they want an earthly king. Verse 15, when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him that earthly king, what does he do? He withdraws. He's like, okay, we were close. And then we get the story of the walking on water. That's the context in which we come to this miracle. Verse 18, the sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. The disciples see Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they are terrified. What happens when you hear the words, do not be afraid? Do not be afraid. That's the angel, right? That's the messenger of God. What are the words that God uses to say, this is my name? The name tag when he goes to the God convention is, I am. Our text, Jesus says, I am. Do not be afraid. And what happens after he says that? Disciples wanted to take him into the boat, and the boat reaches the land towards which they were going. The disciples receive the person they recognize as God, the presence of God in their midst, and by faith they take him in, and they are immediately delivered to the land that they are going. God is present in the world through Jesus. It's pretty incredible that Jesus is multiplying loaves and walking on water. But what is really awesome, what is really wonderful and full of wonder for us is this presence of God through Jesus. Don't be so busy trying to explain away the miracle that you miss what is truly miraculous for us. Don't be so embarrassed by the miracles that you fail to be a witness to them in a world that so desperately needs to hear that good news.